So hooks were introduced to React in version 16.8 all the way back in February of 2019. And it's been a truly transformative feature for most React developers. When I first heard about hooks, my initial thought was, okay, so you can add state to functional components, but what does that do for me? But hooks are so much more powerful than that. And I haven't written a class-based component in years. If you're new to React or a bit confused by hooks generally, hopefully this video will help. If you do find it helpful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. All right, let's take a look. Before we get started, let's take a look at the rules of hooks. There are two main rules that you really need to remember. The first rule is that hooks can only be called at the top level of a functional component. React needs to maintain the order of how it runs the hooks. And if you put a hook in after an early return or inside of a conditional, the order the hooks are run could change. So typically, when I'm writing a component, the first thing I will put inside the component is all of the hooks that I'm using. Then follows any other logic. The second rule is that you must only call hooks from React functions. This really follows on from the first rule, but basically what they mean by this is that you can't call a hook from inside a regular JavaScript function. It must be called from within a functional component or a custom hook. We'll take a look at custom hooks in the next video, so don't worry too much about that for now. There are 3 hooks I'm going to use in this demo, so I'll run you quickly through what those hooks are and what they do. And we'll start with useState. useState does exactly what it says in the tin. It is React's built-in hook that allows you to set and get items in the state of your component. In your component is important in that statement. useState is used to set items in local state only. It won't manage global state for your application. Using the hook is really simple. You import it from React, and the hook itself returns an array that contains the state variable and the function that you use to set the state, or the setter. It takes an argument, which is initial state, and that sets the initial value of the state hook. If you don't set an argument, the initial value of state will be undefined. Next, we have the useEffect hook, and the useEffect hook, according to the React docs, lets you perform side effects in functional components. Some examples that provide of side effects include fetching data, setting up a subscription, or manually changing the DOM. useEffect by default is triggered after every render. In a nutshell, a combination of the lifecycle methods component.didMount and component.didUpdate that you would use in a React class component. However, you have a certain level of control over when useEffect gets triggered, which I will show you in some examples. And finally, we'll take a quick look at useRef. useRef returns a mutable object with a current property. The initial value you pass to useRef will be used to initialize the value for the current property of that ref. And in React, refs are typically used to access DOM elements, but useRef can be used for more than just that. For example, it's basically just a JavaScript object, so you can store any value you want against its current property. However, it won't notify you when it is updated, and therefore, unlike state, it isn't useful for storing values that you want to display on the DOM, for example. To introduce you to React hooks, I'm going to take this small React app that I've built and I'm going to convert it to using hooks. I'm going to use the 3 hooks that I mentioned in the introduction: useState, useEffect, and useRef. As you can see, I've got a title here and a version number beside it. I've got 2 buttons, and at the moment they just console log out some text. And then I have this input, which, as you can see, it changes depending on what I type into it, but nothing happens in the app. And then down the bottom, I've got a footer, which has a timestamp with the latest release. So if you look at this code, and I'm going to start in the app component, and I have a footer component here, which shows you how I'm doing the latest release. But we'll start with the app component, and the app name here, React Hooks Demo, is being used inside this H1. So if I was to change this, demonstration, save that, you can see now it updates the app here. So I'm going to undo that. And then I've got my version number. So that is 1 and 2. Go back to 1. And then I've got these click handlers, which is where these console logs have come from. And these are the buttons. And then again, I have my input. And you can see this is currently an uncontrolled input. What that means is I'm giving it a default value of app name. The value is then managed by the DOM itself, by the component on the DOM. So we don't have access to the value once it changes. So if I was to change the text here, I don't have access at the moment to the value that's changed. So we'll go through all of that. So the first thing I want to do is change app name to state. So I'm going to import useState from React like so. And to demonstrate state, what I'm going to do is just create a fake value in state for the moment. So do const res for result equals useState. And as I explained before, the argument here is the initial state value. So I'm not going to put anything in here, and I'm just going to console log out what res looks like. So you can see here, clear that. And the state value here is an array. So this res here returns an array from useState. And inside the array, there are two values. One is the initial state value, or the state value itself, and the other is the setter, which is a function here. You can see there's a function there. So if you're familiar with destructuring, and particularly array destructuring, because this is an array, I can actually destructure the values of the array into whatever I want to call them. So typically I'm going to call this a value of something. So I'll say state value and state setter. And then I'm just going to log out state value and state setter. And you can see here, we've got the value is undefined, and here's the actual function that setting the state performs. Now, if I want to pass in an initial state value, I'm just going to put in 1 here, and now it's logged out. We've got the value of 1, and we still have that function. So delete this. What I'm going to do is convert app name into state. So I'll put an array around that. And the second argument is that function. So I'm going to say set app name, and I'm going to give it useState with the argument of React hooks demo. So now if I refresh that, delete all this, you can see React hooks demo still works, reload still works. That's the actual state value that we're now using as opposed to a variable. So now I want to use set app name. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect that into this input. So I want to change default value to value, and I want to give it an onChange handler. And I'll do like so. So I'm going to create handle change, and it takes an argument, and the input will pass it an event argument. And the value that I get back from the change event can be accessed through event.target.value. And now I've been given this warning, component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled. I explained at the start how it was uncontrolled, and now we're controlling it because we're going to manage the value that goes in, and we're going to manage the changes that come out of it. So this is expected. So it'll only show up the first time. And I'm going to give that a refresh so it all kicks in. And now what happens is you'll see when I delete a value here, it puts console logs out the new value for the input. But because we're not actually changing the state value itself, it's still showing as the initial state value. So the next thing we need to do is to set that new value in state. So I'm going to delete this console log, and I'm going to change this to set app name. Save that. And now if I delete this, it changes the value in state, and you can see then the app name itself has changed in the app. Second thing I want to do is very similarly, I'm going to change version into a state value. So I'm going to do version, wrap that in an array, set version, use state. And again, pass that initial argument, the initial value of 1 into useState. And then what I'm going to do is new version button already has an on-click handler. And instead of console logging this out, we're going to set version. We're going to take the previous version, which is a number, and we're going to add 1. And now we can still see 1 here, but if I click on new version, I get 2, 3. Each subsequent click adds 1 to the previous value, and it just keeps counting up. There is an alternative way to set state using a setter, and that is to give it a function. And the first argument to that function is the previous state. So it'll be the previous value in state, and then I can say, I'm delete this, and I can say previous state plus 1, And that does exactly the same thing as taking version plus 1. The reason you might do it this way is in case you have quite a complex feature and you're worried that the value that you're using here, version, could be stale for whatever reason. So this ensures that you get the current value in state, and then you can do whatever you need to do with it. The next hook I'm going to import is the useEffect hook. And useEffect, when you use it, looks like this. It takes a function as its first argument. Unlike useState, which takes the initial state value as its first argument, useEffect will take a function, and useEffect will run on every render. If I was to console log out effect and save that, you can see that the initial render shows effect. Anytime I change a version, the component, of course, renders again, so it again will log out effect. So every render, it's going to log that out. Now, the second argument to useEffect is an optional dependency array. So if I was to pass an empty dependency array, that's going to ensure that my useEffect is only triggered on the initial render. So I'm going to delete this, I'm going to give it a refresh, and you see that it shows effect. So this might be useful for loading data, for example. If I want to say, as soon as the component renders, I'm going to load some data, I'm only going to do that on the initial render. I'm going to give that second argument as an empty array. If I click on new version, you'll notice that it isn't logging out effect anymore. In this particular component, I'm going to use useRef as well as useEffect in combination. So I'm going to import useRef. Delete that. And I'm going to set up a ref here. So I'm going to set up a ref for the input. And I'm going to give it an initial value of null. And what I want to do is I want to focus the input when the app renders. So I'm going to give this input ref equals input ref. And I'm going to do input ref.current.focus. So what that's going to do is put focus on that input so that I can start typing straight away as soon as the page renders. Now this code is going to work as is, but you need to be careful when using useEffects, especially when the code inside of it may not be ready. Now input ref will be set on input during the first render, and then useEffect will run after that initial render. But let's say input itself is conditionally rendered, right? So if I was to say, wrap that in brackets, and I was to say version is greater than 1, and then I want to only render that input if version is greater than 1. Save that, and you can see now the app errors because the current value of input ref is null, which is what we've set as the default. Input isn't rendered on the page yet, and therefore the ref isn't going to work. So to get this working properly, we need to use the dependency array, and we need to trigger useEffect based on the conditions that we expect it to work. So in this dependency array, we're depending on input ref, which we're going to put in here, and we're also depending on version number, because we know the input exists when the version is greater than 1. And we also need input ref to exist. useRef itself isn't going to notify you when it changes, but version is specifically. So we want to say if version is greater than 1, then run this code. And if I save this now, you should see it refresh, and then we can clear that, and we can say new version, and you can see that this exists, and it's also focused. I can immediately start typing. And finally, we're going to go into the footer and we're going to use useState and useEffect to update this component. So I'm going to import useState, useEffect. I'm going to change last updated to a state value. So set last updated. I'm going to take a prop of version. And what I want to do is I want to update this last updated timestamp every time a version changes. So to do that, I'm going to take useEffect. And we have the first argument is a function, and the second argument is a dependency array. And I'm going to take the version prop and put it in the dependency array. And I don't need a conditional in here. I know that this needs to be triggered every time a version changes, including on the first render. So I'm going to change the timestamp to say new date. And of course, I need to change this to use state. And now we can see the timestamp below is 3:40 and 57 seconds. I change the version. You can see that this is now changed to the current time. And again, change the version. And this useEffect is being triggered by the version change. And it's changing the last updated date. So hopefully that all made sense, and it can give you a general idea of how React hooks work and how you can use them. I would encourage you to read the React docs. They're some of the best technical documentation anywhere, in my opinion. And have a read through React docs on how the hooks work. Have a look at other hooks like useMemo and useCallback and useContext, which are hooks that once you start using React a bit more, you'll find quite a lot of uses for. So thank you for watching the video. I really appreciate you sticking around this far. And next week, I hope to have a video ready for you with some custom hooks and to give you some examples of how custom hooks work.